It should be used to shape economic policy. The census is a fantastic thing. We are very fortunate to have the Australian Bureau of Statistics. It is one of the world's great statistical gathering bodies. And when you have responsible government, the information that goes in about where our society has needs and where it needs to go is filtered out from those odd questions that you get. I did it today myself and thought, really, does this all count? But of course it does. The filleting of the stats builds up a picture of every suburb, every street, every suburb, every district, and should guide government on where the needs are in our society to make this a better Commonwealth. Of course, it is a particular gripe of mine that the present government has moved a bit of pork barreling into the realm of industrial strength systemic corruption, so that sort of important information to improve our society, to make this a better country for everybody, is being ignored. So yes, please respect the census. It's not a joke. It's a very expensive and very important exercise that makes a difference, if a difference is to be made.
Thanks, Michael. And next question, Andrew from North Sydney asks, since the start of the pandemic, there's been this tension between the economy and people's health. Some have said, let it rip for the good of the economy, and others have said you can't have a healthy economy without a healthy population. Is the answer black or white, or is it shades of grey?
Oh, tricky question. It is, I think it's presently heading towards the grey. I think it has been black and white. It has been black and white, and we demonstrated it with the obvious comparison of Sweden and Australia. Our economy has performed extremely well by locking down when it had to, by seeking to eliminate the virus as much as possible, as opposed to the Swedish model of leaving it up to people pretty much and letting it rip. The Swedish economy fared far worse than ours. Our economy, the way it bounced back, was absolutely extraordinary. It was a case of Australia leading the world. Unfortunately, I think we are now heading into a grey area from what has been plotted out as our 4-phase recovery, as we begin to understand the Delta variant more. What appears to be ahead of us is accepting that 80%, I mean, there are some lowball figures being thrown around, which I think is political spin, but if we were to hit 80% of those eligible to be vaccinated, meaning people over 16, the idea is we will ease up on lockdowns and we will in fact let it rip. And when you see what the experts, the people who actually do this for a living, work through the numbers, that means the virus will rip through the unvaccinated and the very young. Delta does hit the young, not just the old, the way this virus started out doing so. So if you work out the mathematics, if there's roughly 20% or something of Australians under 16, 80% of those above are vaccinated, that is a significant pool of people who are going to be prone to getting seriously ill. Those of us who are vaccinated can still get crook, but we don't get hospitalised. So what we're heading towards now is a situation where the amount of opening up of the economy will actually be determined by how busy our intensive care units are. That was spelled out to me by Dr. Greg Kelly last week. I mentioned it in the New Daily piece, and we saw yesterday the New South Wales Premier bringing an ICU specialist onto her press conference to also explain it, that COVID patients take up a lot of time in ICU, just 3 weeks plus, as opposed to your average ICU patient who's in there for only 3 days. So our ability to handle what happens next will depend upon how busy our ICU units, doubling up on ICU, how busy they are. That when we get to the stage of our medical system being closed down by too much COVID, we're going to have lockdowns again. the essential beginning of, sorry, I've raved on there, but the essential point at the beginning of the question was, of course, yeah, people are the economy. The economy does not exist without people. People have to come first.
Okay, straight to the next one. Catherine from Hunters Hill. As a long-time follower of Australian politics, Michael, can you give us a sense of where you think we're at? Is it as bad as it looks? She asks.
Where do I begin on that one? Yes, it is. I think this is the worst government of my lifetime. I've been a journalist for the better part of half a century now, and there has not been a government with so little care for the basic principles of governance. There has not been a government so willing to trash what is obviously best for the country. I don't think we've had a government that has been captured by a minority view the way this one has. The rat bag end of the coalition has the government by the short and curlies, so to speak. That is a dramatic position to be in, but we saw it demonstrated today by Scott Morrison in his press conference about climate change, where he went for his standard tools of denialism and deflection, dealing with the IPCC report, which can't be deflected, which can't be denied. But he proceeded to do that throughout that press conference. Proceeded to do a look over there. It's an old government line now that it doesn't really matter what we do, because the developing world, if they don't cut their emissions, it doesn't matter what Australia does. And point the finger at China, where emissions are still rising. Carbon is universal. Governments and nations don't emit carbon, people emit carbon. If there's any sense of equity, you've got to accept that our greenhouse gas emissions are a per capita business. Australians emit more than twice as much as the Chinese do on a per capita basis. We are up there on the podium as the world's worst, alongside the oil and gas petro states of the Middle East. We're at that level. How can we possibly sit back and say, oh, look over there at the developing world? There's no point us getting excited about our emissions while they're on the rise. That is the denialism and the deflection. The idea that we can contribute by concentrating on technology rather than actually reducing our carbon emissions as a straight target by pricing carbon, most obviously, is, again, it's a bait and switch. There is good work being done in Australia on technology, but the two headline policies that the Australian government is spending billions on are both jokes. Most obviously, carbon capture and storage. It doesn't work anywhere, not in a rich country. So for Scott Morrison and Angus Taylor today to suggest this is part of the solution for the developing world is a level of hypocrisy that I find astounding. The next bit is the hydrogen valley. Green hydrogen will have a role down the track, but the government's fudging between blue and green hydrogen. Blue hydrogen is burning fossil fuels. And there's no incentive to move from blue hydrogen to green hydrogen unless you price carbon. And of course, the idea of pricing carbon is more forbidden by this government than the idea of just setting a target of zero net emissions by 2050. So there's that. I'm going to rave on a bit more here. Sorry, Kristen, because once I get started on governance, I go bananas. The systemic corruption of using taxpayers' money for purely political purposes is unprecedented. Sports rorts captured the headlines early last year. That was particularly egregious because you were dudding volunteers in clubs all around the country who put in a whole pile of work thinking they were playing a fair game, and the game was fixed. So that was appalling, and it was, of course, waved away, deny, dissemble, deflect. Most recently, of course, we have car pork. which is on another level in terms of money, $660 million, and in terms of skewing towards buying votes. The ratio with sports rorts of coalition seats to Labor seats was 2-1. 62% went to coalition seats, 32% went to Labor seats. With car pork, of course, it's out of the window. But the big daddy of them all, the great representation of what's happening to governance in this country, are the community development grants. $400 million involved just last year, more than $3 billion now since this rort was invented in 2014 to specifically get around the Auditor General. This particular racket, this corrupt system, is on track at the current rate to add up to $5 billion by the time the legislation is due to expire in 2026. It was designed something that you might expect in the New Guinea highlands, handing over money to government members to splash around their electorates. There is no ability to apply for a grant. You have to be selected by the government to get the money. That's unbelievable.
So how does that get around the Auditor General?
Because if you set the rules, the Auditor General can only measure the performance of a program against the rules. And the rules are whatever the government thinks is a good idea, whatever your local member can convince the people handing out the money in government that they need. Mm-hmm. And the split there is worse than sports rorts. The community development grants last year, $400 million, split 3-1, 66% to coalition seats, 21% to Labor, with independents making up the difference. And it's quite possibly worse than that, because when you try to get to the bottom of these grants, some grants are attributed to the headquarters of the organisation getting them, not necessarily the electorate that's getting them.
Oh, really?
And there are other grants. There are other grants that run the same way. Building better regions is another one that gets fiddled. And if you think, well, the government is indulging in wholesale, appalling governance, in systemic corruption, clearly in breach of ministerial standards that every minister and the Prime Minister signed off on in 2018, they got away with it. And the message from the government, whenever the Auditor General does say, hang on, look at this, is simply too bad. We saw that with Simon Birmingham, allegedly, the leader of what's left of the moderates in the Liberal Party, on insiders. He effectively raised his middle digit and said to Australia, too bad, we got away with it, you voted for it, so there. Which makes you think they got to do it again.
Yeah, it's I don't mean to insult South America, but it's the sort of story I'd expect out of South America.
It's it's harsh on South America, Kristen.
America. There are a few stories.
A lot of countries in one sad basket there.
That's true. Well, and a follow-up question to all of that. We've seen the demise of the small L Liberal Party. So where have the Liberals gone in the Liberal Party? Where are those real Liberals? Or we would call them real Liberals.
Look, they became an endangered species. Whether they're extinct or not, I don't know, but there's certainly no evidence of them in policy. I wrote a piece before the 2019 election pointing out that win or lose, the moderate Liberal was gone. The leadership was gone. Between 2016 and 2019, the moderate Liberal leadership quit. There were 8 ministers, assistant ministers, and of course a Prime Minister who were elected in 2016 who did not stand in 2019. Obviously, Malcolm Turnbull, the Deputy Leader, Julie Bishop, Christopher Pyne, Leader of the House, he'd been 26 years an MP, the Ministers Kelly O'Dwyer, Steve Chobo, Michael Keenan and Craig Laundy, Assistant Minister Jane Prentice, all would be considered on the relatively moderate end of the Liberal Party, all gone. And then you sort of get on to those who weren't in leadership positions. Julia Banks, gone, an appalling situation. If I could just digress a little bit there, since I mentioned Julie Banks, There was something in her appearance on the wonderful Misrepresented series on ABC, which went through the keeper because there was so much bigger stuff and more obvious stuff there. But it really struck me that she said what surprised her when she went to Canberra. As a businesswoman, she expected a professional operation, and she found it wasn't. That government was not being done professionally. Leaving the sexism and misogyny aside, it was just appallingly run and haphazard. It's a government without a policy agenda, and it seems to be being sort of stuck together by a bunch of advisors and wannabes who just want to get elected. That's an aside. In terms of what's...
You have context, Michael. Was that always the case, or do you think it's...
Yes, it has always been the case. There is that... It's a terrible thing when you find out an institution you've respected has feet very much of clay, if not just mud. That has always been the case. It has been loose, but there was a professional underpinning to it that has been steadily white-handed, and white-handed by both sides of politics, I would add. We did have a very professional public service, but the public service has now been told, you're not really here to provide policy, you're here to do what we say. You're here to manage the policy that we impose rather than propose policy and work out the best options or give us a series of options. The politicisation of the public service, again, is unprecedented. And if you want to get ahead in the public service, well, you know what to say, you know who to kowtow to, and you don't dare upset the boat. That is the underpinning that we've now lost. And we've seen some of the great mandarins of the public service express dismay about that in recent years.
Yeah, for sure. Laura Tingle did a great article on that a while back. I remember the institutional memory that was lost with that transition. A slightly different economic, from David at McMahon's point, he asks, according to the Economic Complexity Index, which measures industrial complexity, Australia ranks 80th behind Kazakhstan at 74, Argentina 59, Greece at 52, and New Zealand at 51, and half the ASEAN countries. Our own ex-member for North Sydney, Joe Hockey, dared motor vehicle manufacturers to leave, so they did. Can Australia continue depending on primary products, or do we need to think about another future? If so, what kind of future, and how can that be achieved? Big question.
That is a huge question, and it's not an easy question for even someone as loquacious as me to try to tie up quickly. Yes and no. It's not that simple by any means. There is an underpinning that we hear from politicians of all sides of Parliament that, you know, it only counts if you can drop it on your foot. As we become a more advanced society, it is our tertiary industry, our service industries that matter more than manufacturing, as good as it is, and primary industry, as good as they are. And that index, it gets a lot of headlines, but what does it really mean? Sure, it sounds good, but what country do you want to swap your place with? Any of those? No, because we are blessed with a few things. One, we do have natural resources. Don't knock luck. It is a fantastic thing to have both mineral and rural natural resources, to have land and to have minerals. We have a relatively well-educated workforce. We have the rule of law, and we have strong institutions. You've got those things together, you're in a great position to be adaptable. Countries end up doing, by and large, what they need to do, like people. If I don't have to work, maybe I won't work. But if you have to work, you bloody will work. Countries are a bit like that. When you can get away with not having to try too hard, you don't try too hard. But what's most important, rather than trying to pick winners in certain industries, is to invest in the only thing that a government can really invest in the long term, and that is people. You have to invest in the skills and the education and the adaptability of your people. Because if you do that, on top of those natural advantages we have, we'll be able to handle it. We'll have our challenges, but we'll be able to handle it. I was lucky enough to see a presentation quite a few years ago now in Shanghai by an American professor at Hong Kong University. It was at the time when the Americans were wetting themselves about China stealing their toy industry, that you couldn't buy a toy in America anymore that wasn't made in China. One of this professor's grad students actually worked in a factory over the border that made Barbie dolls. And he came up with the concept of Barbienomics. And I haven't got the exact figures on the top of my head, unfortunately, but it was something like, you break down a Barbie doll, something like 50% of the price of a Barbie doll is retailer, is the shopkeeper. Then something like 30%, don't hold me to the numbers, but 30-odd% is for the IP, the brand on it, Mattel, Barbie, which leaves you with 20%. And I don't think it was that much. There's 10% that goes in logistics, in shipping the thing around the world and a few other things. Basically, you get down to the manufacturer who's got 5% of that Barbie. And that 5% has to take in the raw materials to make the thing. So which part of the Barbie do you want? Gee, the IP is good. And that's what you have to end up chasing. Having said that, you do want a diverse economy, you want to be smart, you want to be flexible, you want high-end manufacturing, but more importantly, you want high-end design. And at the same time, in the service industry, you have to make service industry jobs good. There is a myth, there was a great Financial Times article recently, and I can't remember the name of the journalist, but it was brilliant, because lots of countries have this, and states within countries have this thing of, you've got to attract manufacturing good, high-paid jobs. Well, not necessarily. Manufacturing now is mainly done by robots, and you don't pay them much at all. What we have to do is make the service industry good, high-paid jobs, because most of our economy, 60% of our economy, is household consumption. And as most of our economy becomes service, you want the people providing the service to have the money to fuel the consumption that drives us. And as long as we think we can get away with service industries on near slave labour, on minimum wages, casual rates, competing for jobs, if we think we can pay the people who look after us in our aged care centres a subsistence wage, in the end, yeah, sure, for a little while, those of us who are wealthy do well, but in the end, we end up weakening our own economy, and those of us who are wealthy don't end up doing well. And that is a huge big picture thing to try to put up there. But it does come down to being prepared to take a more holistic view of the economy and where we need to get to. Sorry, that was not a short answer, but
no,
it's a very tough question.
Very good write a thesis on that one. I've got Annika. So Annika, if I can bring you on. Annika is one of the young people driving North Sydney's Young Indies. So it's a new group that started quite recently. And this group's reaching out to the young and soon to be voters in our electorate. Annika, if I can find you, where are you? There you are.
Hello.
What's your question for Michael, Annika?
Michael, you've talked about the long-term effects of climate change and COVID. How can young people prepare for the future being handed down to them?
From a starting point, and I think this is really important, from a starting point with optimism. That might sound a little bit contradictory to the negative things I've just been saying, but I think it's important to realise that there is no better time in history to be young than now. Yes, we've got an enormous challenge, an immediate one with COVID, and a bigger immediate one with climate change. But we've also never been in a position better to be able to handle a challenge. Just think about COVID for a minute. We're out of practice with plagues. They were common as dirt. You died scratching your knee and getting a blood infection. We only got penicillin, we only got antibiotics in the 1940s. Before that, mankind's life was brutal and precarious and not too long. Now, with COVID, we have managed to get down into the molecules of the thing, track it, know where it came from, and invent vaccines in no time. That just couldn't be done. And we can do that. And we're proving it, that we can handle something as challenging and as vicious as this virus, because we now have the ability to do so. Similarly, with climate change, we know what we have to do, and we are capable of doing it. And that's fantastic. We've never had that before in our history as a species. We just lack the will. So I think to be a young person now facing the challenges, you've got to start with the optimism, knowing that it can be done. It's a matter of being prepared to do the work, to have the facts, and to pursue honesty, to pursue integrity, and always punish dishonesty and lack of integrity, so that we get to use the tools we've got. Another discussion a while ago now, I came across that comment of some people saying, oh, look, we can't have children because it'd be irresponsible to bring children into this world. No, I disagree. If you want to be invested in the future of this planet, have children. Nothing should make you more determined to make the future good than to be invested in it in your own kids. I don't mean you've got to go out and have children. That would be stupid. But I mean, our future is there to be made more brilliant if we just have the will and the determination to go and bloody well do it. Keep picking the least worst option. Keep working towards getting a good option. And it's there. Oh, that it was so easy. But
Thanks, Annika. That's one of the reasons North Sydney's Independent is here this year for this election. We have to speak up. We're the adults on duty. We've got children. We're invested, and we're going to do it. Andrew from Willoughby. Michael, what's your view on election timing and why?
It changed with Delta. Delta changed everything because the failure in the vaccine rollout and quarantine has now been brought home. I was very sure that we were going to have an election October, November, because everything was looking pretty rosy then. There is an economic cycle rolling through that was looking to be peaking around then. But along comes Delta, and all of a sudden the opinion polls are saying nope. So I think Scott Morrison will be hanging on to the last possible moment in May, hoping for another miracle, hoping for the vaccines to be rolled out and to work, hoping for Delta to recede, hoping for a second bounce back economically from the lockdown. It also means we're going to have another election budget in April. I think the timing will be the same as 2019. A budget in April with all the pork barrelling, all the rorting, all the corruption repeated because it worked last time. Why wouldn't you do it? And then an election very soon thereafter. Have the budget, call the election. It'll be around the same time, exactly 3 years later.
You think it'll be any different if we get a vaccination rate of about 80% in October? You think November would be tempting if the economics for next year look a little dismal?
I know, because the economics for this year are now looking dismal. We bounced back from last year's lockdown, from last year's recession, technically, with incredible speed. It was fantastic. The factors that gave us that bounce back aren't there this time. There's no more raid on superannuation funds, which was massive, which put a whole pile of money into the economy. The great boom that we've had from our tourism deficit, worth $19 or $20 billion a year. Australians in 2019 spent about $19 billion more overseas than foreigners spent here. So in terms of money being held in the country, for all the pain of our tourism industry at home, international tourism industry at home, Australia and the economy overall scored $19 billion. That's more money than the government put into doubling job seeker for a little while. That's the scale of it. But the way economic management works is that the goalposts are always moving. That's been baked into our economy now. We don't get any growth out of it next time round because that's standard. So all the people who couldn't go overseas, who went out and bought a new car instead, if they could get the car they wanted, or who bought art, and God knows there's a lot of that. I bought something, I wanted it framed, and it's a 3-month waiting list. And of course, that's before you get on to real estate and what's been happening there. That particular surge is already baked in. On top of that, we don't have 20 or more billion dollars being shoveled out in JobKeeper to companies that don't deserve it, don't need it, and shouldn't have got it in the first place. So that again is another impetus that's not there. Okay. The bottom line is we have a fiscal contraction happening at the federal level. The federal government sold its last budget in October as being a big spending budget, and it's a big spending budget compared with historical averages, but it's actually less than the previous year's budget. The plan is to take a couple of % of GDP out of the economy this financial year compared to the previous year in terms of federal government spending, because it's relying upon all the money that was sloshing around that's yet to be spent. Now, a lot of it's going to be spent by end of this year, early next year, depending upon lockdowns. And so it's going to roll for a while, but what happens next year? Where's the follow through? It's not clear.
Mm. So then maybe they could go this year before it gets worse next year. No?
Not with the polling the way it is, not with COVID the way it is. And there is that whole messy grey area of states. You know, Australians are pretty good at sorting out the difference between state governments and federal governments, but there's still impact there. You know, I'm not a Victorian. I don't even understand their football. But you get the impression that a lot of Victorians didn't like the attacks on what they saw as attacks on Victoria by the federal government, not just attacks on a Labor premier. So that's going to be curious. Yeah. I can't see them going early this year. They would have to have an awfully dire outlook for the first half of next year, I think, to go early.
Well, that gives us a lot more guests to get on our Q&A Zooms for the next 9 months. We'll be here for a while. That's all right. We're here for a while. That's fine. Judith from Lane Cove West. For years, you've worked on some of Australia's largest media organisations. Are they doing their job? Are they doing the job we need them to do as part of a healthy, vibrant democracy? Media diversity, I guess.
The good news, there is good media out there. There's new media, new mastheads around. I mean, the Saturday paper does a great job. I like to think the New Daily provides a genuine, independent voice. I've got to say, I have never been so independent as I've been able to be on the New Daily with a broad remit. The majority of Australia's media, though, I can't work. Sometimes Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull sort of merge in my mind. And when it comes to hating the Murdoch organisation, yeah, they're the one person. I can't remember which one said the Murdoch empire, it's not newspaper publishing now, it's a political party. And that is the reality. The Australian, the Daily Telegraph, unashamedly are Liberal voices. And as far as Sky News, Sky After Dark, that is Fox News Light. And it's pushing forever further to the right. And that's a bad thing. And the worst thing about that particular echo chamber is not the broad audience that gets it, but it feeds into that hard right end of the Liberal Party. There was a very fine piece written by the bloke who was Mike Baird's media advisor when he was New South Wales Premier about Alan Jones, saying that Alan Jones was not important to the electorate, but the Liberal Party took him awfully seriously. And so you got into trouble politically within the Liberal Party if you didn't do as Alan Jones told you to do, rather than the impact of Jones on the electorate. Because Jones' radio show, while it was top rating, it was only a tiny percentage of the overall population. It was a ridiculous amount of power, political power, in the hands of one man. So back in the big companies, Murdoch is a write-off. In Sydney, at least, you do have some variety. You know, I'm originally from Queensland. I've got friends up there who just got a constant diet of the Australian and the Courier Mail, and that does eat away at people's perceptions if they let it happen. The Sydney Morning Herald has taken a turn, it would like to think, very much to the middle. I think it's gone a little bit to the right. I think they identified that the Guardian has sort of grabbed the left, and so the Sydney Morning Herald would like to be in the middle and get a little bit more towards what it used to have as a conservative base. The editorial side of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald is now run by a bloke who was Joe Hockey's press secretary, and I think that sets a certain tone when you start running opinion pieces from people from the IPA. Hard right, doctrinaire, neoliberal, trickle-down economics. It sets a tone. And again, people and organisations pick up the tone. The bigger problem for journalism, and this is where the smallest violin in the world starts playing for journalists, I suppose a lot of people would say, is that simply there isn't the money, there isn't the time, there isn't the depth that there used to be. There are not the soldiers that used to be there to be able to cover stuff. And I think that's often at its worst at the local level. When you have country towns that don't have a local newspaper anymore, who's keeping an eye on the council? I mean, one of the great things about journalism is that if you call yourself a journalist, if you are a journalist, it gives you a license to ask questions that the layman or woman may not quite have and can't perhaps expect to always get an answer. You know, if the average citizens ask the question of a politician, you tend to get a form letter back from a flunky in the office. A journalist from an organisation with gravitas asks the question, normally speaking, you expect them to at least think about the answer. And when you don't have the journalists, when organisations lose their status, that begins to fall away, and that's a tragedy.
I've heard a lot of the local hyperlocals have been starting up in some country towns. It's almost like an organic response to the absence of them. So hopefully that'll give some light. Hopefully they can sustain themselves.
Oh, look, there is good stuff out there. John Menadew's Pearls and Irritations, which is free. Subscribe to it. If you don't, please do. It always impresses me because on the smell of an oily rag, I'm not even sure the rag is oily, it throws up interesting opinion pieces from people with experience. You may not agree with all of it, but you know, you get a bit of both sides every day, half a dozen. And yet you look at the opinion pieces turning up in our main newspapers, in the Murdoch press, it's just totally predictable. And in the Sydney Morning Herald, it's pretty random on occasion.
Yeah. Well, I'd almost take issue, and I think a lot of our supporters who were Liberal voters, even just last time, recently, would take issue with you calling the Australian and what it spills out as a Liberal doctrine. To be honest, I think a lot of us are wondering, where's our Liberal voice gone?
So if I said Liberal, I should have said political. It's a political organisation rather than a Liberal organisation, because for Murdoch, it's always about power, political power. And as we've seen over the decades, he's prepared to jump on either side of the fence to suit his own purposes. But he is wedded to a degree of climate denialism, and even when they're denying their denialism, it's still seeping through.
Yeah.
And in terms of undermining the body politic, sky after dark does it night after night, and that's not a healthy thing. There was a great piece written by Ted Koppel in the Washington Post a long time ago, more than a decade ago, and it was the American context of explaining that when he started out in journalism and television journalism in America, the three big networks put a lot of effort and a lot of money in trying to get the facts right and presenting the facts each night on the news, so that America would collectively sit down each night, and whichever channel they watched, they pretty much got the same facts. And if you've got the same facts, you can have a debate about, what's right or wrong.
Mm.
But now we've had this splintering where people are choosing their own facts. Fox News, obviously, for the right and the trumpets in the US, the the other mob on the left. Where's the middle ground?
Yeah.
And then when you also have a conscious policy of denigrating the quality of journalism that is in the centre, you're left with the inability to have a debate when people are choosing their own facts.
Yeah. I remember noticing that when my cousin started. I think I said something like, "Oh, did you see Four Corners or 60 Minutes?" Or, there were those regular shows as I grew up in the 70s, 80s and 90s, that Friday night was this and Sunday night, and there was Monday night. And most of the population would come to work and have heard similar stories and have the same conversations. And my cousin, who's, I suppose you call her millennial, she said, "Oh, I don't watch any of that." And I said, "Well, what do you watch?" She said, "I just get my own from the internet." And I thought, wow, she's kind of left. We had this kind of cohesive information body. I don't know how good it was, but it was common. And then it's just become disparate. So,
and yeah, and in terms of professional exploitation of that, Sky News After Dark on Foxtel has a miserable audience, but it's twigged to getting on YouTube and getting on Twitter and Facebook, and gets a bigger audience there with a shorter attention span. And this is an organisation that pushes climate denialism, that airs COVID denialism, vaccine lies, because you can stir up that audience and capture it, and it feeds upon itself.
Robin asks, one of our supporters, why is COVID not yet affecting the growth in the share market? Is the share market likely to crash? She asks.
How about the six numbers that are going to win Powerball on Thursday night? when asking if the share market's going to crash. Yeah, look, it does seem ridiculous. And remembering February of last year, if anyone can remember back that far, it's been such an extraordinary time. Our stock market was hitting a record high in February as the virus was spreading. It was already out there, and we didn't realise it. We couldn't focus on it. Now, cheap money will do it for you. When money is free or almost free, the price of all assets will rise. That's why real estate is through the roof, because money is nothing. We're going to see a lot more merger and acquisition because money is nothing. Reserve Bank figures show that big business in Australia, on average, can borrow for less than 2%, 1 point something percent. Now, 1 point something percent, A, it's tax deductible. B, take away inflation. In real terms, it's negative cost. It is more than free money. And when you've got free money, people go out and buy stuff. Your average Australian races out to buy some bricks and mortar, but also some shares. And the smart money piles into assets, because there's no point leaving money in the bank when it's not earning anything in going backwards.
Yeah.
So that cheap money, that global wash of trillions of dollars, is pushing up assets all around the world. It's not healthy. At some stage, there will, of course, be a reckoning. But, we'll have a correction. But as long as money's that cheap, and as long as there are good businesses showing a profit, and you can buy shares in good businesses paying dividends in this country, you're getting a couple of % plus franking credits on a dividend. That suddenly looks really good.
Very good. Yeah, thank you very much. Ian from Camaray. Michael, what are the green shoots in the economy, do you think?
The green shoots in the economy are what they've always been, to a degree, or have been for a while. China, not just China, but the rest of Asia, particularly Southeast Asia. There is, if you want to take a longer term view, we have the potential, if we're smart, to have another China. Kerry Packer said you only get one Alan Bond. Well, Australia has only got one China, and we have ridden the back of iron ore to do extremely well, and we are still doing that. But the Southeast Asia has the potential to do it again, because it's starting from a higher base with a middle class that will want what every middle class wants: experiences, education, travel, the stuff that we're good at, lifestyle, as well as more of the infrastructure and quality food and veg as well. The services that we can provide, if we're smart, that we could do. Can I squeeze in 2 quick examples, if I can remember to keep them quick?
Yeah.
We missed a great opportunity on medical tourism. Bad policy by both sides of politics was scared about Australia having too many doctors. And so we didn't train enough. And consequently, we've had to import doctors from overseas. And we've got a medical system that is brilliant, but it excluded the potential. We didn't go after servicing the rich people, the well-off people of Asia to come here. And so instead they go to Singapore. That was a missed opportunity. That was dumb. Maybe we can get that back. The other example that I really love is Tasmania. Tasmania, that place that we leave off the map a lot, the one that, you sometimes joke, we tried to give it to the Kiwis, but they didn't want it because they play the wrong football. Tasmania, which was for decades Australia's traditional basket case, is now Australia's top performing state on a lot of measures. Business conditions have been favourable in Tasmania for half a dozen years, and I first began to notice it a half dozen years ago. And you know what changed Tasmania? One private individual's art gallery. Mona changed Tasmania. There are other factors, but the spark was one individual putting in an extraordinary art gallery that would attract a different sort of tourist to Tasmania, tourists from around the world, as well as the mainland, and the sort of tourists who want a better coffee, who want a better meal, who want a better hotel, and they built them, and Tasmania became cool to go to, and it fed from there. There's more to it than that, but one art gallery changed a state's economy. I find that inspirational because it's an example of how we overlook the services sector. We overlook universities, their contribution to the economy. We overlook the arts. We overlook a side of a more developed country that we can have. And I think I lost the plot there somewhere, Kristen. But the point I wanted to...
They sound like green shoots. No, that's great. And surely renewables and the new economy, the global revolution that's happening that we're missing out on at the moment.
Absolutely, which is, the Reserve Bank, which is not exactly a bunch of left-wing pinkos, has been banging on about this for years. The Reserve Bank's been desperate to see greater investment, and it's pointed to the areas that are ripe for investment in this country, with obviously the renewable economy being the most obvious if we're prepared to seize it. But what are we doing? We're investing in future stranded assets. We're investing in gas pipelines and subsidising new gas fields in the Northern Territory and fracking instead of the renew economy, which is unbelievable. The RBA, I'm a big fan of the RBA. It's not perfect, but in terms of their ability to try to see the big picture, to be apolitical, to be rational, it's a very fine thing. And it's been an extremely frustrating half dozen years or more for the Reserve Bank.
Well, here at NSI, we're very optimistic about the renewables economy. And if we can just get the LNP out of the way for a few years, I think we'll get it going.
Matt Canavan, the Craig Kelly of Greenhouse, and the Craig Kelly of other stuff too. But yeah, okay.
Yes, we've got a bit of work to do. We'll do it. We're working on it. Independents are working on it. Denise, we're nearly out of time. What's going on in the chat? I'm seeing lots of little things down there. The Conversation is another publication that's great, I find, to read.
Yep.
I mentioned that. What else, Denise?
Hi, everyone. And firstly, thank you to both of you. It's been such an interesting discussion. And the chat has been very active. And thanks, everyone, for joining us on a Tuesday evening. Certainly, concerns echoed regarding the rorts Michael was really raising. General agreement in the chat on election timing. Don't think that will be until next year. We know we've got the council elections now on December 4, and of course, half the country's in lockdown. So agreement there, yes. Also saw several people also saying the conversation is also highly recommended. Glenda made a great point also about social media and its role in the mix of misinformation and perhaps disinformation that people are consuming. A really nice comment from Nadine that I just wanted to read out. Well said, Michael. We are in an incredible position today to make some incredible positive change. People power. We all need to act. Can't leave it up to the politicians. I thought that was really nice. If I can squeeze in one quick question, Andrew, this perhaps leads on to a broader discussion, a little broader discussion. The probability of independents holding the balance of power after the next federal election, Michael. Not putting you on the spot or anything.
This is the Powerball 6 numbers question again, is it? Look, I think there's a high probability, very high probability. It's happened before. It happened with the Gillard government, when you had a couple of independents who were able to achieve a great deal and government worked. This time round, you get the sense that there are a lot of people who don't want to vote for Labor, but don't want to vote for what the Liberal Party has become. So if they're given the option of a rational, middle of the roads, it's a dangerous term because everyone's middle of the road is different. But I think a rational Australia first policy, I don't want to use the phrase Australia first, a rational policy being put up by independents now have a fantastic opportunity to grab that disaffected rational voter that really does not want an extreme right-wing government that has got irrational policies on climate, on governance, on human rights. Just the Billa-Wheeler family alone. I've got to say, for me personally, the Billa-Wheeler family alone, I find impossible to think of voting for any party that continues to do that. And that represents obviously a lot more than those two little girls and their parents. But it's a symbol of what Australia has become. And that's not my country.
Absolutely. Love to hear that. Thank you, Michael. One last question, and it's actually to North Sydney's Independent from Gary Kirabilli, who is asking about our candidate. And as those who actually read our newsletter will know, we're going to announce our candidate in September. That's when we expect to announce. We'll be preparing to announce in September. And we're very, very excited. The calibre has been very high. So we hope and pray everybody else agrees with us. We believe you will, and we believe the candidate we will have ready in September will beat Trent Zimmerman at the next election. So that's it for the night. While we're signing off, if everyone could please tell us in the chat what you got out of this evening, or maybe what's one thing you could do to help turn North Sydney independent again. If you don't already, please subscribe to North Sydney's Independent Friday weekly newsletter, because that's the key place to keep track of our news and our progress. And we'll be letting you know probably about our candidate dates there in the coming month. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another special guest, so please keep an eye on NSI's newsletter for forward plans. And a big thanks so much to Michael Pascoe tonight. Thanks everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next time.
That's good.